"Ma'am, step out of the vehicle. This car matches a stolen report." The words cut through the quiet highway like flashing blue light through darkness, sharp, certain, and already convinced of a story that hadn't happened. Angela Brooks didn't turn off the engine right away. She didn't reach for the door handle. She didn't even look surprised. Her fingers rested calmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel as the red and blue reflections moved slowly across the polished dashboard of her black sedan, painting the inside of the car in restless color. She had been on the phone just seconds earlier, speaking in a steady professional tone about a case that would reach the governor's desk before sunrise. But now the call screen had gone dark, replaced by silence and the faint ticking sound of cooling metal under the hood. In her rearview mirror, she could see the patrol car angled behind her, blocking the shoulder as if she were already under suspicion instead of simply pulled over on a quiet stretch of state highway 15 miles outside Richmond. The officer stepped out slowly, one hand resting near his radio, the other swinging a flashlight that traced a narrow beam across her license plate, then her rear window, then finally the side mirror like he was inspecting evidence instead of approaching a citizen. Angela inhaled once, steady and controlled, the way someone does when they already understand the shape of what's coming next. This wasn't the first time she had seen lights like this behind her. It wasn't even the second. But something about the way the patrol car had closed the distance so quickly, something about the way it stopped too close, something about the way the officer walked toward her without hesitation or curiosity, told her this stop was different. This stop already had a conclusion. Gravel shifted under his boots as he reached the driver's side window, the flashlight beam now resting directly on her hands, then her face, then the interior of the vehicle as though he were searching for confirmation instead of answers. "License and registration," he said before she could speak. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the weight of someone who believed he already knew what he was dealing with. Angela reached slowly toward the center console, careful, deliberate, respectful of every movement the camera on his shoulder might already be recording. The leather folder he noticed first sat beside her right hand, embossed with a small gold state seal that caught the light for only a second before she moved her arm across it. He didn't comment on it. He didn't ask about it. He didn't seem interested in it at all. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to the window and said the sentence again, slower this time, like repetition could turn suspicion into certainty. "This vehicle was reported stolen earlier tonight." Angela looked at him then, not defensive, not frightened, just studying him the way someone studies a decision that hasn't been made yet, but already feels irreversible. "Officer," she said quietly, her voice calm enough to slow the moment, even as the flashing lights continued to pulse across the pavement behind her. "You're making a serious mistake." He smiled when she said that. Not a friendly smile. Not a curious one. The kind of smile someone gives when they think they've heard that sentence too many times from too many people who turn out to be wrong. He stepped back half a pace and rested his hand near his belt again, already shifting from conversation to control. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated. Angela didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She only glanced once more at the silent phone resting in the cup holder beside her, the call she had been on still unfinished, the message she had been about to deliver still waiting somewhere on the other end of the line. And in that quiet pause between the flashing lights and his second command, something passed across her expression that the officer didn't recognize yet, but would remember for the rest of his career. Officer Daniel Mercer did not lower his flashlight when she spoke again, and that small detail told Angela more than his words ever could, because experienced officers usually listened first before repeating an accusation they could not yet prove. But Mercer did not ask a single follow-up question, and he did not check his radio before speaking again, as if confirmation was unnecessary once he had already made up his mind. He stepped closer to the driver's side window until the beam of his light reflected sharply against the polished trim of the door and said slowly and clearly that he needed her to step out of the vehicle immediately, not as a request, but as a decision already finalized somewhere inside his head before he ever left his patrol car. Angela kept her hands visible on the steering wheel and watched him carefully, not with anger and not with fear, but with the quiet attention of someone who understood that every movement now mattered more than anything she had said earlier that evening during her call. A pickup truck passed in the far lane behind them and slowed slightly as the red and blue lights washed across its windshield, the driver turning his head just long enough to recognize a traffic stop that already looked more serious than routine. Angela spoke again in the same calm tone she had used before, explaining that the vehicle was registered legally and that there must have been an error somewhere in the system. But Mercer did not respond to the explanation and instead shifted his stance so that his body blocked the shoulder more completely, as if preparing for something that had not yet happened. He asked her where she had obtained the vehicle, and his question carried the kind of certainty that suggested he was not expecting an answer he believed would be true. Angela answered simply that the car belonged to her, and that the registration was inside the folder he could already see near the center console. But Mercer did not reach for it, and did not ask to inspect it, and did not look at the state seal pressed into the leather surface that caught the light again for just a second before disappearing under the shadow of his sleeve. Instead, he glanced once toward his patrol car, and then back toward her face with a short expression that looked less like curiosity and more like confirmation of something only he could see. The radio on his shoulder cracked softly with a voice asking for status from his unit number, but Mercer did not respond right away, and the silence that followed felt longer than it should have on a quiet stretch of highway that usually carried nothing more dramatic than late evening commuters heading home. Angela noticed the hesitation and understood immediately that dispatch was trying to reach him for a reason he had not yet shared with her, and that realization settled somewhere deep behind her calm expression as she lowered her hands slightly from the steering wheel but kept them visible in the soft glow of the dashboard lights. Mercer repeated the instruction for her to step out of the vehicle again, and this time his voice carried less patience than before, as though he expected resistance that she had not shown and did not intend to show. Angela reached slowly toward the door handle and paused for a brief moment before opening it, the cool night air moving quietly into the car as the flashing lights painted the asphalt beside her shoes in alternating color. She stepped onto the shoulder exactly as instructed and stood beside the door without speaking, waiting for the next sentence he believed he already knew he would say. Mercer moved half a step closer and looked briefly past her shoulder into the interior of the vehicle again, where the leather folder remained in plain view between the seats, untouched and unopened, and still unnoticed in the way details sometimes remain invisible until it is already too late to change what they mean. Behind them, another set of headlights appeared in the distance and slowed as they approached the scene, and in that growing wash of light Mercer finally reached for his radio, as though he had remembered something important only after the moment to avoid it had already passed. The second set of headlights that had appeared behind them did not pass like the others had, and Angela noticed that immediately, because drivers usually slowed for a moment before continuing on their way. But this vehicle reduced speed carefully and then stopped several yards behind Officer Mercer's patrol car, as if the scene ahead had already become something worth watching. Mercer spoke quietly into his radio at last, giving his unit number and location with a tone that sounded controlled but slightly tighter than before, and Angela recognized the difference because she had heard that same tone from officers who were no longer completely certain they were in control of the situation they had started. Dispatch answered him almost instantly, asking him to confirm the license plate again, repeating the numbers slowly as though accuracy mattered more than speed, but Mercer only confirmed once and did not repeat the registration information that Angela had already offered him earlier. The voice on the radio asked a second question that Angela could not fully hear, and for the first time Mercer hesitated before answering, as if the response he needed to give required more certainty than he actually had. He stepped away from her slightly and turned his shoulder toward the patrol car, lowering his voice enough that the words disappeared into static and distance, but the hesitation remained visible even from where she stood beside the open door of her vehicle. Angela kept her posture steady and her hands relaxed at her sides, watching him without interruption because she understood that moments like this often decided whether a misunderstanding ended quickly or continued longer than it should. The car behind them remained stopped, and its engine idled quietly in the dark, while someone inside lifted a phone toward the flashing lights, and the reflection of that small glowing screen moved across the highway shoulder like another signal that the scene had already begun to change shape in ways Mercer did not yet recognize. When he finished speaking with dispatch, he returned toward her with a slower step than before and looked once again into the interior of her vehicle, his eyes moving past the steering wheel and across the center console, until they stopped briefly on the leather folder resting between the seats. This time he noticed the gold state seal more clearly, and the pause that followed lasted just long enough for Angela to understand that something in his certainty had shifted even if he had not yet admitted it aloud. He asked her where she was coming from that evening, and his questions sounded different now, less confident and more careful, as though he were searching for confirmation instead of repeating an assumption. Angela answered simply that she had been working late and was returning from a meeting that had taken longer than expected, and she added that she needed him to review the registration documents before the situation continued any further because the vehicle was legally hers and the delay was unnecessary. Mercer looked at her for a moment as if deciding whether to accept the suggestion or ignore it again, and behind him the headlights of the stopped vehicle brightened slightly as another car slowed to observe what was happening on the shoulder. The quiet stretch of highway that had seemed empty minutes earlier no longer felt isolated, and Angela understood that every passing minute made the situation more visible than it had been when the lights first appeared behind her. Mercer reached toward the open driver's side door at last and leaned slightly forward to look more closely at the folder on the center console, but instead of picking it up immediately, he paused again as though the decision to open it carried consequences he had not expected when he first stepped out of his patrol car. Angela watched that hesitation carefully because she recognized what it meant when certainty began to give way to doubt. And in that narrow space between his first assumption and his next decision, she realized that whatever he discovered inside that folder was going to change the direction of this stop in a way neither of them could reverse. Officer Daniel Mercer's fingers hovered just above the leather folder for a moment longer than necessary, and that hesitation changed the atmosphere on the shoulder of the highway in a way neither flashing lights nor passing traffic could explain because uncertainty, once it appears, never stays quiet for long. He finally reached inside the vehicle and lifted the folder carefully as though it might confirm something he was not ready to accept, turning it once in his hands while the gold state seal reflected the patrol lights in sharp pulses of red and blue that made the emblem impossible to ignore now that he was actually looking at it. Angela watched him without speaking because she understood that the next decision belonged to him and that anything she said in that moment might only delay what he needed to discover for himself. Mercer opened the folder halfway and stopped again, as though the first page carried more weight than a routine registration document should have carried on a quiet roadside stop. Behind him, the vehicle that had stopped earlier remained parked with its engine running, and another driver slowed in the far lane before continuing forward more slowly than traffic normally moved along that stretch of highway at this hour. Mercer glanced briefly toward his patrol car as if considering whether to return to his radio before continuing. But instead he looked back down at the folder and turned the first page fully open at last. His expression changed slightly then, not dramatically and not enough for someone standing farther away to notice, but enough for Angela to recognize that the certainty he had carried earlier was beginning to loosen its grip on him. The document inside did not resemble the type of paperwork he expected to find during a stolen vehicle stop because the formatting was official and the language precise, and the identification number printed beneath the state crest did not match the assumptions he had repeated only minutes earlier. He shifted his stance and read the line again as though confirmation required repetition before acceptance. And then he looked up at Angela with a question forming behind his eyes that he had not asked yet, because asking it would mean admitting he needed clarification instead of giving instructions. Instead of speaking, he closed the folder halfway again and stepped back from the vehicle as though distance might restore the certainty he had carried when he first approached her window. The radio on his shoulder sounded once more with dispatch requesting confirmation of his location and status again, and this time the voice carried more urgency than before, as if someone on the other end of the line expected information that had not arrived quickly enough. Mercer answered briefly but did not provide details about the document he had just read, and Angela recognized that hesitation as another signal that the situation was no longer moving according to the version of events he had imagined when the patrol lights first appeared behind her. The passing traffic continued to slow as drivers noticed the growing stillness around the stop, and the quiet presence of the parked vehicle behind the patrol car remained unchanged with its headlights steady and its driver still holding a phone toward the scene. Mercer looked once more at the folder in his hand, and then back at Angela as though trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment that could not exist together at the same time. And when he finally spoke again, his voice sounded more careful than before as he asked her why she had not mentioned earlier that she carried official state credentials inside the vehicle. Angela met his gaze calmly and answered that she had suggested he review the documents several minutes earlier, but that he had chosen not to look at them then. And the silence that followed her response stretched longer than either of them expected, as Mercer realized that the next thing he said would determine whether this stop ended as a misunderstanding or became something much more serious than either of them had planned when the flashing lights first appeared behind her on that empty stretch of highway. Officer Daniel Mercer held the leather folder a little tighter than before, not because it was heavy, but because the meaning inside it was beginning to feel heavier than the situation he thought he was handling only minutes earlier, and the flashing patrol lights behind him suddenly felt less like routine procedure and more like a spotlight he could not step out of. He looked down again at the state crest pressed into the document and read the identification line once more as though repetition might change what it said, but the words remained exactly where they had been the first time he opened the folder, and they carried a level of authority that did not belong on the shoulder of a quiet highway during a late evening traffic stop. Angela Brooks remained beside her open driver's side door with the same calm posture she had held since stepping out of the vehicle, her hands relaxed and visible, and her expression steady in a way that made the silence between them feel intentional rather than uncertain. Mercer shifted his weight slightly and glanced back toward his patrol car again as the radio on his shoulder crackled with another request from dispatch asking him to confirm the vehicle status one more time. And this time the tone on the other end sounded sharper, as if someone in the communications center already understood that the delay meant something had changed. Mercer answered briefly but did not mention the credential folder still in his hand, and the hesitation in his response carried farther than his words because Angela could see the moment he realized he could no longer rely on the explanation he had started with earlier in the stop. A sedan passed slowly in the far lane, and the driver inside lifted a phone toward the flashing lights again before continuing down the highway at a reduced speed, and the parked vehicle behind the patrol car remained exactly where it had stopped several minutes earlier with its headlights steady and its presence quiet but unmistakably observant. Mercer finally looked up from the document and studied Angela more carefully than he had at any point since approaching her window for the first time, as if he were trying to reconcile the calm confidence in her voice with the authority printed clearly across the page he now held. He asked her whether she was currently traveling from an official assignment, and the question sounded less like an accusation and more like an attempt to understand how the situation had reached this point without warning him sooner. Angela answered that she had already explained she was returning from a late meeting related to state work, and that she had suggested earlier that he review the documentation before continuing the stop, and she added quietly that the delay was beginning to create complications that neither of them had expected when the patrol lights first appeared behind her vehicle. Mercer looked once more at the credential page and then toward the quiet highway around them, as if searching for confirmation from somewhere outside the narrow circle of flashing lights that surrounded them. And the uncertainty that had begun as a hesitation now settled more clearly into his posture as he realized the situation was no longer unfolding according to the assumption he had made when he first stepped out of his patrol car. The radio sounded again with dispatch repeating his unit number and requesting immediate clarification of the vehicle registration status. And this time Mercer did not answer right away because he understood that whatever he said next would travel beyond this quiet roadside moment and into a report that could not be rewritten once it was recorded. And in that brief silence before he responded, he finally recognized that the stop he believed would end quickly was already moving toward consequences he could no longer control. Officer Daniel Mercer finally pressed the radio button on his shoulder, but did not speak immediately, and the silence that followed lasted long enough for the voice from dispatch to repeat his unit number again with a sharper tone that carried the unmistakable expectation of an answer that could no longer be delayed. He cleared his throat slightly and confirmed his location once more before pausing again, as though the next sentence required more certainty than he was prepared to provide. And Angela noticed that hesitation the same way she had noticed every other change in his posture since he first opened the credential folder beside her seat. The highway around them remained unusually quiet except for the steady hum of passing tires in the far lane and the idle engine of the vehicle that had stopped behind the patrol car several minutes earlier, its headlights still directed toward the scene, as though the driver understood that something important was unfolding even if no one had said it aloud. Mercer lowered the radio slowly and looked back at the document in his hand one more time before turning toward Angela with an expression that no longer matched the confident certainty he had carried when he first approached her window. He asked her whether she currently held an active state appointment connected to the identification inside the folder, and his voice sounded careful now, as though he were stepping across unfamiliar ground with each word he chose. Angela answered calmly that the credentials were current and valid, and that the meeting she had just left involved matters that required her to return to the office before midnight, and she added that the delay on the roadside was beginning to interfere with responsibilities that could not easily be postponed. Mercer glanced again toward his patrol car, and then toward the quiet stretch of highway ahead, as if measuring how far the moment had already moved beyond his control, and the radio on his shoulder sounded once more with dispatch repeating his unit number and requesting confirmation of the registration status in a tone that suggested someone else had already begun checking information from another source. He lifted the radio again, and this time confirmed the plate number more slowly than before, reading each character carefully as though accuracy now mattered more than speed. And when dispatch answered, there was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted just long enough for Angela to recognize that something unexpected had appeared in their system. Mercer listened without speaking and then lowered the radio slightly away from his shoulder, while his expression changed in a way that made the flashing patrol lights behind him feel suddenly brighter than before. He looked at Angela again with a question he did not ask aloud, and she understood that he had just received information he had not anticipated when he initiated the stop several minutes earlier. The vehicle behind the patrol car shifted slightly as its driver adjusted position to continue recording the scene, and another set of headlights approached slowly from the distance before reducing speed as well, drawn by the unusual stillness surrounding the stop. Mercer finally spoke again and asked whether she had informed her office about her route that evening, and Angela answered that her schedule and location were known to staff who were expecting her arrival shortly, and that confirmation could easily be verified if necessary. The silence that followed that answer carried farther than the sound of passing traffic because Mercer understood that verification no longer depended only on what he believed, but on what others were already beginning to confirm beyond the edge of the highway shoulder, where the patrol lights continued flashing steadily into the night. The radio on Officer Daniel Mercer's shoulder spoke again before he could respond, but this time the voice from dispatch did not sound routine or distant, and instead carried the unmistakable tone of someone who had just received confirmation that changed the meaning of the entire stop. Unit 24 confirm you are with Ms. Angela Brooks, the dispatcher said carefully, pronouncing her name with the slow precision used when accuracy mattered more than speed, and Mercer did not answer immediately, because the question itself already revealed that someone beyond the roadside now understood exactly who was standing beside him under the flashing patrol lights. Angela remained still beside her open driver's side door, watching him without speaking, because she recognized the moment when uncertainty turned into realization even before the words reached him completely. Mercer lifted the radio slightly closer to his shoulder and confirmed her name after a brief pause that lasted longer than it should have, and dispatch responded again almost instantly with a message that sounded more like instruction than inquiry as they informed him that her credentials had been verified through the state registry system only seconds earlier. The quiet highway around them seemed to hold its breath in the seconds that followed as Mercer lowered the radio slowly and looked toward Angela again with an expression that no longer matched the confidence he carried earlier that evening. The vehicle that had been parked behind the patrol car remained in place, and its driver adjusted position slightly to keep both Angela and Mercer inside the frame of a raised phone screen, and another set of headlights slowed in the far lane before continuing past at a reduced speed as though the passing drivers understood they were witnessing something more significant than an ordinary roadside stop. Mercer opened the leather folder again as if confirmation from dispatch required confirmation from the document in his hand, and the gold state seal reflected across his uniform once more as he read the identification line for the third time, even though the words had not changed since the moment he first saw them. Angela spoke quietly then and asked whether he needed additional verification from her office before continuing, her voice steady and calm in a way that made the silence between them feel deliberate rather than uncertain. Mercer answered that verification had already been received through dispatch, but his voice carried hesitation because the sentence did not solve the question of what he needed to do next. The radio sounded again, and this time dispatch informed him that a supervisor unit was already en route to his location after the registration confirmation triggered a review request from the communications center, and the announcement changed the atmosphere of the stop more clearly than anything that had happened before. Mercer looked down the highway in the direction the supervisor vehicle would arrive, and then back toward Angela, as though measuring the distance between the assumption he had started with and the reality now approaching him from several miles away. The flashing patrol lights continued to reflect across the asphalt shoulder in steady pulses, while the quiet presence of the parked vehicle behind them remained unchanged, its driver still recording the scene without interruption. Angela adjusted her jacket slightly against the night air and waited without speaking because she understood that the arrival of another unit would mark the moment when the stop no longer belonged only to the officer who had begun it. And Mercer finally realized that whatever explanation he had prepared earlier would not be enough once the next set of headlights appeared on the horizon and brought someone else into a situation that was no longer his alone to control. The first sign that the supervisor unit was approaching did not come from the sound of a siren, but from the quiet change in the rhythm of traffic several miles down the highway, where distant headlights began to slow earlier than usual, as though other drivers could sense the shift in the atmosphere before the vehicle itself appeared. Officer Daniel Mercer noticed the approaching lights at the same moment. Angela Brooks did, but neither of them spoke because the meaning of that arrival no longer required explanation. Dispatch confirmed over the radio that the responding supervisor was less than 2 minutes away, and the voice carried a formal tone that signaled the situation had already moved beyond a routine roadside interaction into something that would be documented and reviewed long after the patrol lights stopped flashing on the shoulder of the highway. Mercer adjusted his stance beside the open driver's side door and looked once more at the credential folder still in his hand, as if searching for a version of the moment that might return the situation to what it had been when he first activated his emergency lights behind her vehicle. But the document remained unchanged, and the authority printed across the identification page carried more weight now that confirmation had arrived through dispatch and through the approaching unit at the same time. Angela remained calm beside her vehicle and watched the distant headlights grow brighter with each passing second because she understood that the arrival of another officer would not only confirm what had already been verified, but would also establish a record of everything that had happened since the stop began. The vehicle parked behind the patrol car remained in place with its driver still recording quietly from inside the cabin, and another passing sedan slowed noticeably before continuing forward at a reduced speed, as though the scene itself had become something people recognized even without knowing the details. Mercer lifted his radio again and confirmed that he remained on location and that he was waiting for the supervisor unit to arrive before continuing further, and his voice sounded measured now in a way that reflected the awareness that each word he spoke would be preserved in the communications log alongside the confirmation already transmitted by dispatch minutes earlier. The approaching headlights finally separated from the distant traffic pattern and moved steadily toward the shoulder, where the patrol lights continued flashing across the pavement in steady pulses that illuminated the quiet roadside scene with a rhythm that felt more deliberate than before. Angela adjusted her position slightly against the cool night air and kept her attention on the approaching vehicle, because she recognized that the next few moments would determine whether the misunderstanding that had started the stop would end quietly or expand into something that required explanation beyond the highway shoulder where they stood. Mercer closed the credential folder carefully and held it at his side, as though preparing to present it to the arriving supervisor. And the silence between them grew more noticeable as the second patrol vehicle slowed behind his cruiser and came to a controlled stop several yards away, with its headlights washing across the shoulder and bringing a new presence into a situation that had already begun to change direction long before the vehicle reached them. When the driver's side door of the supervisor unit opened and a uniformed figure stepped out into the alternating red and blue light reflecting across the asphalt, Mercer understood that the moment he had been trying to manage alone was no longer his to shape. And Angela watched the approaching supervisor with the steady patience of someone who already knew that what happened next would finally make clear why this stop had never been as simple as it first appeared. The supervisor stepped fully into the glow of the patrol lights, and the moment he recognized Angela Brooks, his posture changed in a way that required no explanation because respect, when it appears suddenly, always reveals what someone else has just realized too late. "Ma'am," he said immediately as he approached her instead of Officer Daniel Mercer, his voice calm, but unmistakably formal in a way that carried farther than the flashing lights or the quiet traffic moving past them in the far lane. Mercer remained still beside his patrol vehicle holding the credential folder he had opened only minutes earlier, and the difference between how the supervisor addressed Angela and how the stop had begun settled heavily into the silence surrounding the roadside shoulder. Angela acknowledged the supervisor with a brief nod and explained that she had been delayed while returning from a late state meeting and that she was expected at the office before midnight, and the supervisor listened carefully before turning toward Mercer with an expression that was no longer uncertain about what had happened during the stop. He asked Mercer quietly whether the registration confirmation had already been received through dispatch, and Mercer answered that it had, though the hesitation in his voice made clear that the confirmation had arrived after the stop had already continued longer than necessary. The supervisor accepted the leather folder from Mercer's hands and reviewed the identification page quickly, not because he needed verification, but because procedure required acknowledgement once the situation had moved into official documentation territory. And then he returned the folder to Angela with a respectful motion that marked the moment when the roadside interaction shifted from suspicion to accountability. The parked vehicle behind the patrol car remained in place, and its driver continued recording as another sedan passed slowly in the far lane, its occupants glancing toward the flashing lights before continuing forward with the quiet understanding that something unusual had taken place on the shoulder that evening. The supervisor spoke again and explained that dispatch had already logged the verification through the state registry system, and that a brief report would be completed to clarify the misunderstanding before Angela continued her route, and his tone made clear that the explanation now belonged to procedure rather than assumption. Mercer listened without interrupting because the structure of the conversation had already changed in a way that left little room for the certainty he had carried earlier in the stop, and the flashing lights behind him reflected across the pavement with a rhythm that now felt slower than before, as though the moment itself had shifted direction. Angela thanked the supervisor calmly and reached for the driver's side door of her vehicle again. But before stepping inside, she turned once more toward Mercer and spoke with the same steady voice she had used from the beginning of the stop, reminding him that assumptions made too quickly can travel farther than patrol lights on a quiet highway, and that accuracy always matters most when authority is involved. Mercer did not respond immediately because the meaning of her words had already settled into the space between them more clearly than any explanation he could offer at that moment, and the supervisor nodded once before stepping back toward his vehicle to complete the final confirmation through dispatch. Angela entered her sedan and started the engine again as the patrol lights reflected briefly across the windshield before dimming in the distance. And as she pulled carefully back onto the highway, the quiet stretch of road ahead seemed unchanged except for one difference that could not be seen from the shoulder she had just left behind, because sometimes the moment someone believes they are enforcing the law becomes the moment they discover the law was already standing in front of them all along.